I think the quote unquote real numbers will be, at least in the low double digits. I wouldn't expect to see the official numbers show double digits right away. But if, the longer this goes on, you could hit double digit official CPI.
Let's start with inflation. So the inflation figures came in at 7.9. Is it 7.9%? I think yesterday. The CPI figures. Are those figures, would they already have been arrived at prior to these events, or do they include these events?
So these pretty much would have already been arrived at prior to these events for the most part. And so it's really kind of the next few prints that I think are going to be heavily impacted by these. And so, for example, I've been on the inflationary side, but I've also been on the side that, we might start peaking by the second quarter, right? That inflation might not normalize, but that it could kind of top out and chop around for a period of time. And the caveat that I had, I say, okay, what is the risk that's not correct? What is the risk that inflation just keeps soaring higher? And it would be some sort of energy shortage, some sort of key thing like that. And so this war as a catalyst certainly adds fuel to the inflationary fire, right? So we already had inflation from money printing, from other shortages going into this. And now that you have an acceleration of commodity shortages and bifurcation of global supply chains, that should add further fuel to the inflationary fire. And so, it kind of remains to be seen how long this is going to go. But we start approaching more like the 70s at this point in terms of energy security and overall inflationary levels. And one thing I pointed out recently is that we have the most negative real yields on say short-term U.S. Treasuries since 1951. Right, so currency is getting devalued at a rate that has not been seen for quite a long time, and that's using the official numbers.
All right, I'm sure you don't want me to ask you this question, but what is the kind of range of inflation numbers we could see maybe next month? Do you think we could be going into double-digit inflation? Could we go into 15% inflation? Because when I look at the price rises for various things within the supermarkets, I look at the increase in petrol prices. We're not talking about 5-6% inflation prices here. We're talking about things that are going up 10%, 20%, 30%.
So I think the official numbers, so next month, using that specific time frame, next month or two, I don't think you'll see a gigantic gap, because if you look at the way the calculation works, a very big chunk of it is actually home, right? So there's owner's equivalent rent and and things like healthcare, right? So those are unlikely to change rapidly in a month. If anything, we're seeing kind of home prices sort of kind of level out to some extent. They're cooling off compared to what they were doing over the past 2 years. And so there's a big chunk of the CPI index that won't change much. Now, the part that is going to change a lot is the food and the energy, right? So that's the part that's going to be, spiking up by double-digit percentages. And that's where everyone kind of has their own unique inflation basket. So the official CPI number, it'll be hot, but it might not be as high as you think. But then, for example, let's say your house is paid off and you have a pretty tight monthly budget. Maybe you're living on fixed income, for example. So obviously a big chunk of what you spend on goes towards food and energy. So someone in that situation, their effective inflation rate would be double digits. And so I think the quote unquote real numbers will be, at least in the low double digits. I wouldn't expect to see the official numbers show double digits right away. But if, the longer this goes on, you could hit double digit official CPI in the US.
This is something Eric Weinstein talked to me about. He said having an official CPI figure is actually mainly useless for most people. Actually, people need a way of being able to calculate their own personal inflation numbers. I'm not sure if that's something that's particularly possible, but I think you're kind of alluding to the same point there.
Basically, yeah. There's no, so inflation's kind of an arbitrary basket. What they do is they kind of take a sample of what the average household uses. So what percentage of their expenses go towards housing? What percentage of their expenses go towards medical care? What expenses goes towards transportation? And they kind of formed this, this quote unquote average basket. And then they track over time what happened to the inflation of that basket. But then it's further tricky because instead of doing home prices, they do like owner's equivalent rent. And they also do hedonic adjustments. So they basically, if things get better over time, like if a car gets better than it was 5 years ago, even if the price doubles, they'll say, well, it kind of stayed the same because sure, it doubled, but it got better. And they'll also do replacements. So for example, if a prime cut of meat goes up in price, they'll assume that you rotate it to a lower quality or lower price cut of meat. And so there are kind of ways to smooth out and lower that number compared to what if you just look at a raw number. If you just kind of pick something like what are bacon prices doing over a long period of time, generally you'll see that prices like that are a little bit higher than what the CPI basket's saying because you don't have those hedonic adjustments, you don't have those kind of replacement things kicking in.
Right. So for anyone listening rather than watching the video, as Lyn explained that they have a way of smoothing out this number, she had a wry smile across her face, a little grin. I mean, you're basically saying it's kind of manipulative.
Well, yeah, every change they've done to the CPI index has been lowering it, right? So it's not like they say, okay, we wanted to make this more accurate, and this will actually this will state inflation's a little higher than we were previously saying. No, that never happens. It's always every change they make to it is, well, it's actually a little lower because if you take into account X, Y, Z, and so you do get this understated level. Now, there's still informational value in the CPI index, but you have to know what you're looking at and break out certain things from it if you really want to go into the specifics, because you do have this kind of artificially constructed basket with hedonic adjustments. And again, hedonic adjustments, they seem to go one direction. So a lot of services got lower quality over the past couple of years, right? So flying is less pleasant than it was before, and it was already unpleasant, right? So, but are they having negative hedonic adjustments in terms of flying? No, of course not. So no. It's like, hedonic adjustments and ways that they recalculate the index generally only point towards ways to try to understate it to some degree.
So this transitory period that we've been sold is seems to be going on a bit longer than I think they expected. And I'm going to assume you're not agreeing with any of these mainstream articles that have been coming out recently trying to explain to us why inflation is good for us.
No, I don't believe inflation's good. And it was kind of, in some ways, I viewed it as inevitable at this point, right? So with so much debt in the system, there's almost nothing that's going to happen other than trying to inflate the way out of it. So it's not surprising. I think, if you were to ask me 2 years ago when I was calling for inflation, would I expect it to be almost 8% officially? Probably not, right? So even as someone in the inflationary side, this has been a stronger inflation surge than I would have guessed. Obviously, war is adding to that now, but even before the war, this was already just in place. And so basically, when you have the combination of a rapid expansion in the money supply with various constraints, so supply chain constraints, commodity constraints, labor constraints, any sort of constraint, you're going to get price inflation.
Well, do you know what one of the weird side effects of this is that even with this business that I do, we have contracts. We have advertising contracts, and some of them are multi-year. And when me and Danny went to get coffee earlier, I was saying to him, do you know what? We probably actually need to have an inflation clause within the contract. Is that something that, I guess what I'm getting at is like I thought of this just now. It's something I just thought, shit, I should really be considering this. Is that something that's like generally considered, or do you think that's something a lot of people are considering, like myself, as a new clause they need?
So in some of the longest term contracts, it's pretty common to have inflation components. And so, for example, if you operate a pipeline, for example, and you're regulated for like what you can charge, usually they will have inflation components. The same thing would be true for long-term leases for real estate. They often do have an inflation component. And it's because when you expect to operate a contract for years and decades, you start to take it into account. Now, often shorter term, 2, 3, 4, 5 year contracts, often those, won't have those type of things. And so one of the challenges in inflationary environments is that there's just more frictions in terms of doing business because, when prices aren't stable, it's hard to do long-term planning, and it's hard to structure contracts. It's hard to determine how much you're going to pay your input providers because you don't even know what you're going to be able to charge your customers, right? So there are some companies that have they naturally have quick turnover, right? An example would be like a toll road, right? There are just people driving through paying all the time. Whereas if you build something, right, you order raw materials, you make these contracts come in, you hold some inventory, it might be a 6 month turnaround until that's a finished product, right? And so if you kind of contracted your selling prices and you didn't have the same duration on your input prices, you could do all this work and then not make a profit because your profit margin was 5% and that got kind of deleted by inflation, for example. On the other hand, if they structure it very well, they can benefit from it. They can be like, well, we managed to have long duration input costs and we managed to have adjustable selling prices, and so we did great in inflation. So that's where investors have to be careful about things they invest in, because they try to find ones that can adjust their revenue faster than they while having a lot of fixed costs for their inputs. And so, but just in general, from an economic standpoint, it's a more challenging operating environment for most types of companies when you have unclear inflation and pretty high inflation.